especially through the traffic in Kapa'a. But you guys are in for a special treat. You guys are in the right place, and it's in the right time, just like anything else. But this morning, we're going to actually, there's been a little change in the program. And before you guys get too excited about that, I did want to assure you guys that our presenters have developed this program to be very overlapping in nature. And the content that you guys might have thought you guys had come for, first thing, which is the addictions and loneliness, actually we'll be starting it off with anxiety and depression, or coping with anxiety and depression. But with that being said, it's designed to overlap, right? So you're going to get content on both lectures if you guys decide to stay that will be very beneficial and also meaningful for each other as well. So I thank you guys again. Our first presenter here is Amanda Anguish, and she's been in practice for, correct me if I'm wrong, over 15 years?
Yes.
Yep, over 15 years. And then she's also had, you guys can read her bio, her brief bio here in the bulletin, but she has a master's degree from the University, Loma Linda University, in marriage and family therapy. And her counseling experience includes substance abuse, depression, anxiety, teenage growing pains, spiritual development, and issues that affect relationships. Amanda also enjoys lecturing on a variety of mental health topics. And so we're very excited to have you and Dr. Binus here this morning, and we look forward to learning so much from you. If you guys would like, because this is something that I realized last night, because the information, there was so much information, and you know, we can only take in so much. So what I would recommend is actually taking notes. And if you guys would like some note paper, we actually have some note paper for you folks. And if you guys need a pen or pencil, we'd be happy to go ahead and assist you. Does anyone need that? Just go ahead and raise your hand. Awesome, and then we'll get those papers over to you guys as the lecture goes on there. I did want to remind you as well.
Let me just say something really quick. If you want to take pictures with your phone, I'm not opposed to that. So if you want to do that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Amanda. And then just to remind you that we do have 3 more lectures after this one. And it's going to be on anxiety and depression, addictions on the second one. The third one's going to be how we can optimize our mental health and optimize our brain for peak mental performance. And then the last one's going to be about healthy relationships, and that's tomorrow at 5 p.m. We also have a potluck, and we would love to have you guys join us for that, and we'd like to get to know you guys also a little bit better. We also have food for tomorrow as well. So please come back and enjoy it and join us for the entire series. We're so excited to see you guys. And without further ado, take it away, Amanda.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I want to start with a little plug for my colleague, Dr. Binus, because sometimes when you hear addiction, what do you think of? Drugs and alcohol. But those aren't the only addictions that people have. And sometimes we don't like to admit all the other addictions that people have, but Dr. Binus isn't going to just be speaking to people who know or have addictions with drugs and alcohol. He's going to be talking about all kinds of addictions. And that's one of my pet peeves, is so often we focus on drugs and alcohol, we don't realize there are many, many, many other types of addiction. But today I want to talk to you about depression and anxiety. And I don't know if you knew this, but depression and anxiety has only gotten worse since the pandemic has started. So we've had depression and anxiety getting worse and worse for probably the last 2 years, even more so than it was before. But I want to paint a little picture of depression and anxiety even before that in terms of loneliness. Wow, those kids sound really good, don't they? I want to sing with them. That's actually a cure for depression and anxiety, by the way, singing happy songs like that. But, so I wanted to share with you, before the pandemic, did you know there was a pandemic even before COVID? There was a pandemic of loneliness. And a pandemic, that loneliness was often precipitated by depression and anxiety. So much so that even in the UK, before this all happened, they instituted a director of loneliness in the UK. Anybody want to take on that job? It's a sad job to have, but the reason they noticed is a lot of people were lonely. And I think some of the things that we talked about last night in terms of, media and stuff, that's one of the ways that keeps people lonely. We think we're more attached, but in fact, we're actually a lot more separated. But I want to talk to you about depression and anxiety, and I'm going to start with some of the symptoms that people have, because often when we think of people who have depression, we think of people who are crying all the time or sad all the time, but there are actually signs that kind of go under the radar, and so I want to focus on the signs of depression and anxiety. So let's start with anxiety signs. When you think of anxiety, you think of things like worry or being on edge. This is actually one of the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder, which is the accurate term for anxiety. When somebody says, I have anxiety, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a diagnosis of anxiety. It could be temporary and in the moment. But when somebody has pure anxiety all the time, there's just this underlying feeling of being on edge and never feeling rested or settled. Feelings of nervousness, unease, even panic can be one of them. And another one, this is like the epitome of anxiety, and that's the racing thoughts, where you just can't seem to stop the cycle of thinking over and over and over again about certain things, or even lots of things. It's like a rush of just thinking just comes through your head. And then also when it comes to specifically PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, you can even have this feeling of hypervigilance. You start with maybe the symptom of unease or restlessness or something in your body where you just don't feel relaxed. But when it goes into PTSD, you can have this feeling of hypervigilance where you're constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're waiting for something bad to happen, something critical or crisis-like to happen. With anxiety also comes like physical symptoms. So those are the mental symptoms, but we're going to talk about the somatic symptoms or the physical symptoms. Difficulty or rapid breathing, when you feel like you just can't catch your breath. Tightness in your chest. Sometimes people even suspect that they're going to have a heart attack, but the tightness in their chest, it comes back over and over again. Stomach aches. Oftentimes children, when they have anxiety, they have lots of stomach aches. One thing that I didn't mention last night is when I was younger, there used to be this commercial, and it was Dutson Driving School in Southern California. Did anybody ever live in Southern California or see this local commercial? It was for Dutson Driving School, and throughout the whole commercial, they talked about all these different things, and at the end, this woman said, "Ask me, I'm Debbie Dutson." And she was a truck driver too, which I thought was really cool. I wanted to be a truck driver because Debbie Dutson was. But one of the things that commercial reminds me of is oftentimes we don't realize that sometimes those things that we're talking about to other people, those are things that we're actually dealing with too. And for me, when I was a little kid, I had terrible stomach aches all the time. And you can ask me, because I'm a therapist now, I know where those stomach aches came from. They came from my anxiety. I had horrible anxiety, and I had bad depression too. Often they go hand in hand. But stomach aches and headaches can be a sign, especially even migraines and stuff. Obviously, you can have migraines for different reasons, but one of those reasons can be tremendous anxiety. Again, the restlessness, that's the fidgeting. Some people, will tap their feet a lot or, do things with their hands and stuff. Muscle tension. If you have tightness in your body in certain places that just perpetually ache and stuff like that, that can be from anxiety too. Fatigue. Think about it. If you're thinking about thoughts all day, every day, and you're never shutting down any of that, wouldn't you be extremely tired? We think tiredness comes from physical activity, but sometimes it comes from mental activity too, and you can be extremely tired if your muscles are tense, if you're going through all of these somatic symptoms and stuff. So that can cause extreme fatigue. Sleep problems. Do you know this is actually one of the biggest reasons for sleep problems? Depression and anxiety? Because what's going through your mind when you're trying to sleep? All these thoughts and stuff that you haven't processed necessarily. So a lot of people who have anxiety have extreme difficulty sleeping. And I'm going to share something that you can do later on in this presentation if you do have trouble sleeping. Hot and cold flushes or flashes, shaking, bowel issues, that can even be from anxiety too, and dizziness. Those can be anxiety symptoms. Also, you can have some phobias with anxiety. Some people have extreme phobias. This is not like, I just don't like spiders. This is like jump on the chair, get a exterminator out here right now kind of thing with different things. And there's so many different phobias that people can have. I couldn't even list half of them for you. And then another sign of anxiety can also be obsessing and or compulsions to ease the anxiety. So that's what we call obsessive compulsive disorder and stuff. And then the nightmares or the flashbacks, that usually goes with PTSD. So I'm giving you different anxiety disorders within the symptoms too. Now I want to go over some of the depression signs. You can have prolonged sadness or unexplained crying spells. I think one of the reasons for the unexplained crying spells when I talk with my clients though is what happens when you're crying all the time. You start to beat yourself up that you're crying all the time, which makes you cry even more, and it just becomes this vicious cycle of I can't stop crying because I'm so hard on myself for crying in the first place that now I want to cry about the fact that I'm crying all the time. And it just keeps going and going and going. But then you can also have significant,
We're actually in the US, and there's an actual US constitution, and that actually says there's a separation of church and state. And what the church brings to us is an understanding of religion, brings to us something that is other than science. What you're bringing to us is scientific dogma, scientific knowledge. You said that you were preaching last night. I'm just wondering if you have a place in the church here.
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but...
We have a US law here which is called separation of church and state.
Uh-huh.
It comes under the US Constitution. Now what you're preaching to us doesn't come under religion, it comes under science. I just wonder if you have a place in the church here.
I'm a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
And you're bringing us science rather than religion in the church.
Well, some of the things I'm sharing with you aren't just purely science. They're things that I experience in my sessions with my clients. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we can have significant changes in appetite and sleep patterns. We can also have things like pessimism and indifference to things. When I talk about indifference, another word for that is apathy. And when you have apathy, what do people often say? Things like, I don't care. I'm just kind of numb. And I think oftentimes what that is from is sometimes when you care so much, when you have so much empathy for all the things that are happening around you and within you, your body has this protective mechanism where it shuts down and it says, I just can't feel anymore. I'm done. I'm tired. And so that's where I think a lot of apathy comes from. Loss of energy and persistent lethargy. Again, if you're worrying all the time and you're exhausted from crying and stuff, you can get really tired from all of that, right? Next one, feelings of guilt and worthlessness. Now, there can be some good reasons for this feeling of guilt and worthlessness, not necessarily the worthlessness, but the feelings of guilt. And this is something that I'm going to touch on a little bit later in this presentation too. But that feeling of worthlessness, sometimes that's from things that people have said to us and we've experienced in our families or those around us. But also we can have we can experience poor concentration and indecisiveness. In fact, sometimes we don't realize that If you forget a lot of things, that doesn't necessarily mean you're old. A lot of times we think we have dementia or we're getting close to dementia when we can't remember things, but sometimes that has nothing to do with age. It has to do with depression. And you can have a depression onset of what looks like dementia and stuff, and you take care of the depression and then the dementia goes away, or those feelings of indecisiveness or trouble concentrating and stuff go away too. Inability to take pleasure in former interests. So if there are things you liked to do before and suddenly you just don't feel like doing them anymore, that can also be part of the depression as well. Social isolation. This is one of the things that, caused a lot of people to feel depressed, is we're isolated socially. And I think the past 2 years have made this even worse, because what were we told to do? Isolate from people. And sometimes that's what we need the most. That was one of the hardest things as a therapist, because one of the things I like to do with my clients is not just refer them to medication. I like to refer them to other ways that will help them too. And what happens when all of the ways that are going to help them are things that now, because of COVID, we can't do? I can't tell them to go to a Bible study. I can't tell them to get out and, spend time with other people and these things, because a lot of stuff was shut down, and in some cases still is. Unexplained aches and pains. We don't realize when sometimes we're not taking care of things, our body starts talking back to us and saying, hey, I need help, and those aches and pains can be a sign of depression. And then reoccurring thoughts of death or suicide is another way too. And scars, often in patterns, can be a sign of self-harm and suicide. Fresh cuts, scratches, bruises, bites, marks, or other wounds can also be a sign. Sometimes if you're working in a medical facility or things like that, people will present with these different issues and stuff, and they'll give excuses for them, but really, in actuality, it's because of self-harm behavior. Excessive rubbing of an area to create a burn. Even sometimes we think of cutting and we think that's the only way to self-harm or suicide, but there's other ways that people do it. Having sharp objects on hand that they might be using, and then wearing long sleeves or long pants even in hot weather. Now, this isn't necessarily a sign of self-harm. Sometimes there are, kids or people who have issues with body issues where they don't feel comfortable and they want to cover up, but it's just something to be aware of, that if you're around somebody that has, is wearing clothing that doesn't seem to match the weather. Now, you guys have a pretty mild temperature here, so you're probably all wearing typically the same thing most of the time. But in some places, I work with kids who wear hoodies, even when it's 100 degrees outside, because they want to cover certain parts of themselves. Frequent reports of accidental injury, difficulties in interpersonal relationships. When you notice somebody changing their behavior or their relationship patterns pretty quickly or abruptly. Behavioral and emotional instability, impulsivity, and unpredictability. That can be a sign of self-harm and suicide. Statements of helplessness, hopelessness, or worthlessness. Now, I have to tell you with this, what I'm noticing more and more, because, it used to be that mental illness had a stigma with it. We didn't talk about it at all, but now it's almost like we're shifting completely to the opposite side, and especially celebrities and things like that are talking about it all the time. They're writing books on these sorts of things. And so what do you think young people are talking about? They're talking about wanting to hurt themselves or wanting to die all the time. And so these statements of helplessness and hopelessness or worthlessness, they can almost be perpetual to try to get a reaction out of somebody to do something for them. That doesn't mean we, react or overreact. It means it's a sign that something might be off. And then even overachieving. When I talk with my clients about different behaviors that they might be doing, I often show them that there can be two extremes. If I feel like I'm not good enough, I can go to the extreme of not trying at all, but then I can also go to the other extreme of trying too hard. I get involved in everything and I overburden myself trying to prove, that I'm more than nothing and stuff like that. I want to talk with you now about some contributors to depression and anxiety, because I think this is really important. And I don't think a lot of people realize how certain things that society is doing is affecting people. And one of the things that is contributing to depression and anxiety, one of the top things that I'm noticing right now is dystopian themes. And these are themes in books, on TV shows, and other sorts of things where the focus is on societies with great suffering or injustice. Another thing too that I didn't necessarily put in with this, that is on the rise, like more than you know, is fantasy and sci-fi sorts of things. Dr. Bynus talked last night about, fewer and fewer kids especially are reading, but I can tell you what they are reading when they are reading, and a lot of what they're reading is sci-fi and fantasy type books. Even often too, anime is involved in this as well. I like to look at the books that my kids are reading, and oftentimes if they're readers, they'll bring books into my office with me because I know they're reading them when they're waiting in the lobby and stuff. And I notice that a lot of them are reading these very depressing themed books and stuff. There's a lot more that I can tell you are in these books. I haven't read them personally myself, but I do research them because I want to know what my clients are dealing with. But what's the problem with dystopian themes? Yeah, it's nihilistic. It's very nihilistic. And so what kind of attitude would you have about life if everything is really sad and depressing all the time? You'd have a very sad and depressing view of life. And unfortunately, if these kids especially are staying indoors and they're in front of their computers or they're reading and they're not interacting with people, what happens? You get a very limited view. It used to be said like, oh, what's the real world like? Well, the problem is the real world has bits and pieces of everything in it. And so when you get out into the real world, you can get out into the really dark stuff, but you can also get out into the light stuff. And there are really great people in the world. And unfortunately, we're not going to see that if all we do is watch very dystopian type themed things. And that includes television shows too. When they're making a crime scene show, do you know oftentimes that show is set in a city, and that city doesn't have the amount of crime that you would see in that show, but what they do is they take all the worst cases of crime that they can find, and then they condense it and concentrate it into this one city, and you think that the city, all it ever had was bad things happening. And I'm not saying bad things don't happen, but what about the good? There is good things happening too, and I believe that if God is still in charge of this world, is he not going to have bits and pieces at least of himself in everything that's going on? He absolutely does. And so when we're focusing on the darkness and not on the light, what's happening? Drug references. It normalizes dysfunctional coping and lifestyle. If I grow up in a home where my mom is depressed, and when she picks me up from school, she takes me home and leaves me in the house, and she goes and grabs a bottle of whatever it is from the cupboard and takes it to her room and slams the door. What do I learn about dealing with depression as a child? What's the only way that I've learned to cope? A bottle and isolation. But what if I grow up in a home, same scenario, except instead of when my mom picks me up from school, she says, Amanda, Mommy has some depression today. She's not doing so hot. What do we do when Mommy has depression? I don't know. Sing a song? Yeah, we sing a song. We sing a happy song. And so we sing a song, and Mama says, Mama's feeling better, but she still doesn't feel, herself yet. What else do we do? I don't know, Mama, go on a walk? She goes, yeah, that's what we do. Remember the last time we went on a walk? I started feeling better afterwards. So we go on a walk and we focus on all of the nice things around us. And then I notice as we do those things, Mama starts feeling better. What do I then learn about when I'm dealing with depression one day? That there's another way of handling it besides drugs and alcohol and other references to those sorts of things. So this is really important, that when we watch these things or we have all of this stuff around us, we're actually infiltrating our minds with poor coping versus healthy coping. I mentioned crime scene shows, but one of the things I don't think we often realize that is, what do I start thinking about now when it comes to other people? Do I think people are safe? No. If all I'm ingesting is unhealthy, negative people that are hurtful and harmful, what am I going to think unconsciously when I go out to run my errands? Be careful, Amanda. And I noticed this once because I used to like crime scene shows because I like psychology and I thought it's cool to, learn all these different traits of these psychopathic people. I know that sounds really demented, but I've since stopped. But I remember one time I watched a show and I was literally going to walk across to the gym that was in my complex, and I had to take my keys because I had to get in the gym and I had to lock the door behind me. And what did I do as soon as I locked the door behind me? Stuck all my keys in between my fingers and I started walking like this. And it dawned on me, why are you doing this? And I realized I had just watched a crime scene show. Why wouldn't I do this? The world is scary and awful. And I thought, well, that's really sad. Nobody in my complex seems really scary and awful. And here I am trying to protect myself as though something really bad is going to happen. So we have to be careful. I think a lot of social anxiety comes from this. If we have a large ingestion of, news and all kinds of awful things, what am I going to think about the people around me? And what we don't realize, too, is then we start to perpetuate that. If somebody walks into this church and they're very defensive and they're holding their body like this and they're looking around like that, how are you going to look back at that person? You might go, oh, they're a little weird. I might want to, steer clear of them. What's wrong with them? And so we're actually perpetuating, when we're suspicious of people, our body language tells other people whether to come close or to stay further away from us. And when they stay further away from us, then what does that do? It reinforces the belief that I had that you're dangerous, right? Or I can't be around you. And this is often how social anxiety starts. It starts with one thing and it keeps building. Pornography and sex can contribute to the depression and anxiety too. One of the big things that we don't realize is guilt is a huge precursor to depression and anxiety. When you know you're dealing with something, when you know that you're doing something that is not healthy, you start to feel shame, you start to feel guilt. And then that builds and builds. But there's other scientific things too that are the effects of pornography and sex. And we don't realize it breaks families apart. It pulls us further away from God. Do I want to go close to God when I know there's something in my life that is not conducive to building a healthy relationship with Him? And we all know that these things are talked about in the Bible too. Social media, we talked about that last night, so I won't get too into that, but Dr. Binus talked about FOMO, that fear of missing out. I love to tell people, did you know you're always missing out? As soon as you choose this thing, you're missing out on this thing. So you are literally always missing out. If you're right here, do you know you're missing out on something else you could be doing? I'm not saying it's better, but if you always have a fear of missing out, all you're doing is reinforcing that something over there might be a better choice than what I'm doing right here, rather than making what I'm doing right here the best thing, right? Technology, this can be an addiction to, and also addiction to being busy too. Shows, movies that normalize depression and suicide, this is becoming more prevalent too. The more we normalize it, the less we're doing anything really about it. We're just talking about, and I see people even, I run a group Monday through Friday, and one of the things I notice when people get too familiar with their depression and anxiety is they start talking about it like this is who they are. Like, forget I'm Amanda, I'm depression today. I just want you to know how depressed I am. What are you? And then the other person starts talking about their anxiety, and now all they're doing is talking about that versus the other aspects of themselves too. Focusing on the negative and tragedies and doubt. Sometimes, what's been the topic of conversation the last 2 years? The main topic of conversation. And now we have another thing that's happening in the world right now that's becoming the topic of conversation. Are those the only things that are happening in the world? No. How about poor diet and exercise? We don't realize that what we put in here affects up here. And one of the things I like to tell people, especially men, I think typically, appreciate this, is if you had your dream car, would you put just any kind of oil or any type of gasoline or anything like that in it? I see people treat their cars better than their bodies. I'm putting nothing but the best in my car, but if it tastes good, I'll eat it. But we don't realize whatever you eat, whatever you put in your body, through your eyes, through your ears, everything, that is fuel for your body. And if you put the best fuel in, you get great thinking. But if you don't put the good fuel in, why else would we, think we're depressed and have anxiety? But I never think that Satan just attacks with one weapon. Sometimes we have our little things that we like to talk about, but we don't realize Satan's not limited. He's not going to go, oh, I'm only going to attack this way. He's going to attack on all fronts from all directions. And so we have to be careful, too, that, as we're thinking about these things, we don't just get so focused on one thing that we miss all the other stuff. And I do think poor diet and exercise can be a huge factor in this. Substance use and early sexual experiences, there's a lot of science on that, but I also see the effects on it too. When you give yourself to somebody else, you don't realize that you don't always get that back. And so I see a lot of young people, especially when they get involved in these things. I always say you have the plumbing, but you don't know how to use it. Young people have the plumbing, but they don't understand how it affects your heart and your mind when you do some of these things. Living in opposition to our values. Just like I mentioned pornography and sex, when we live against our values, we don't realize that. I'm suspecting that most people in this room grew up maybe in Christian homes, or at least had certain values that brought you back into the church and things like that. But when you believe something and you leave that belief, there's something that happens in your mind. And this is why, what happens when, the research shows when people have children, they come back into the church? Why is that? Because they want their kids to be raised with the same values they've had growing up themselves. Now, I know not everybody does this because maybe we've had some bad experiences, but a lot of people will come back into the church because what's stirring inside of them? Those values that they learned early on, but yet they're living against those values until they have children. And when we have kids, we start eating better and we do all these things because we want our kids to be raised in this perfect little cocoon environment of all these good things, but we don't realize what's that doing to my mental state and my emotional state when I'm living in opposition to the things that I grew up knowing to be true and valuable. Focusing on being happy versus duty. If you are focused on being happy all the time, you will be depressed. You know why? Because it's only through doing work and duty and the hard things that we actually get that nice dopamine hit that actually makes us happy. And this is why, we might talk about this tomorrow and stuff, but the happiest people are the people that stay in their marriages. The happiest people are the people that stay working at their jobs. They don't just up and jump every time something difficult happens. I'll tell you, my last job, I was there for 7 years. It was the hardest, most excruciating thing, and not because of the group home kids that I worked with. It was actually the staff and the administration that was the hardest. You'd think, I expected the kids to be hard. I didn't think I'd also have to fight against the staff and the administration and stuff. But I'm so glad I stayed because God taught me something in that. Not just that I needed to change some things in my own character, but he taught me that I was stronger than I thought I was. And when you push through things, there's an invincibility that you start to feel. I like to call it a Christian invincibility. I think it's why God says, come boldly before the throne, because when you go through difficult things, you realize, wow, I'm actually capable of more than I thought I was, and it's not me who's capable, it's God working in and through me, and sometimes that only happens through difficult stuff. So we have to focus on duty sometimes more than just being happy. Lack of prayer and Bible study in a relationship with God can also be a contributor to depression and anxiety, because who created us? Our cars come with a manual. We also come with a manual too, and that's the Bible. And sometimes when we avoid those things, how do we start to feel? What do you think? I think this is one of the saddest things that we often do when we raise our kids without God. When I'm a little kid and I don't think that, I can handle something, who do I turn to? My parents, because they're bigger than me and they know how to handle stuff, right? But what if I'm an adult and I don't have my parents around and I can't handle something? I need God. Psychologically, I need to know that there's something bigger than me out there that can handle the stuff that even I can't handle. And so if we avoid prayer and we avoid studying the Bible, it takes us away from that God that can protect us and take care of things, which, if I'm not doing those things, then I can easily have more depression and anxiety, because how do I stand up against all the things in this world that are difficult if I don't have somebody bigger and better than me helping me through it? So what can we do about this? One of the things that I love to teach people, I like to think of myself as a thinking expert. Maybe I'm not an expert at anything else, but I like to think of myself as a thinking expert. And this is one of the things I wished somebody had taught me when I was younger. I'd love to go into elementary schools and teach this maybe someday when I have time to, because this is the one thing that we do up to 80,000 times a day, and nobody really sits us down and teaches us how to do this. Every single one of my clients, when they come into therapy, they come for one or two reasons. The first reason is how they're feeling. I'm feeling depressed. I'm feeling all kinds of anxiety, or I'm feeling apathy, or I'm feeling guilt, or I'm feeling hopelessness. The other reason is behaviors. If I'm feeling all of those things, what am I doing? Am I usually doing good things? No. I'm doing the quickest thing to make me feel better for a very split second, but what does it often do? Actually makes me feel worse. So say, for instance, I'm depressed, and I seek out food to make me feel better. I learned at a very young age that I just need to eat and I'll feel better. So I go seek out food. Does that make me feel better at first? Absolutely, because it tastes good. And I know exactly what I like. Maybe it's something really sugary or salty and oily or something like that. But how does that make me feel after? Does that make me feel less depressed? No, and sometimes it can even add guilt to it. Many times it even adds guilt to it. And then I start this cycle of these feelings and these behaviors. So I like to help people with certain behaviors. The most important reason why people come to therapy is their thinking, and this is the part that they don't realize. It's actually the way we think about our circumstances that affects I do and why I feel the way I do. So if I can change my thinking, then I can, next slide, if I change my thoughts, then I can change my behaviors and my feelings a lot better. Next slide. So I have to ask every single thought that I have that's a difficult thought or leads to those negative behaviors and feelings, I have to ask those thoughts, is this actually true? Do you know how many problems we would solve in our own heads if we merely asked the question, is this true? So-and-so doesn't like me. Is that true? Do you know what they do in a court of law if you don't know the answer? This is the problem with our brains. We don't like to not have answers, so sometimes we fill in the blanks so that we have something even though we don't know if it's true. So if I feel it's true, I might say, well, I think it's true. But is a feeling the same as a fact? No. So in a court of law, if you don't have enough facts, what happens with a case? It gets thrown out, right? If we just said to ourselves, you know what? I have no idea if that's actually true that that person doesn't like me. You can resolve a lot of problems. But what we like to do is go, well, they looked at me that way, so obviously they don't like me. We fill in the blanks. Instead of saying, you know what, I don't know. I'm going to set this aside until I do know, or I'm going to ask them. Just make sure. That would help a lot of things. The next question we could ask ourselves, is this helpful though? So with truth, we have to look for evidence. And I would suggest, where's the best place to find evidence? God's Word. He says it never, ever changes. He never changes, right? So it's always the truth, no matter what. But we can also ask ourselves, is this helpful? Because some things are true. If I messed up at work, like I royally messed up. I cost my company a lot of money. I failed at getting the task done that I wanted to do. Is it true that I messed up? Absolutely, it's true. No bones about it. I messed up. But is it helpful for me to tell myself that 5 times a day, 10 times a day, for the next week, the next month, the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? Do you know how many people do that? We tell ourselves things that are true, but they're not necessarily helpful. And I'll give you an example. If your pastor is preaching and the person next to you doesn't hear something that he says in his sermon, but it's really important, do you think, to know, and that person leans over to you and says, hey, what did he just say? If you tell that person what the pastor just said, what happens? You miss out on the next thing that the pastor says, and you're always trying to play catch up, and you get further and further and further behind. This is the same with things that are not helpful. If I'm beating myself up about something that happened last week, last month, last year, the last 5 years, and I'm still beating myself up, what have I missed out on? The opportunity to grow from the experience, the opportunity to make up for the experience, the opportunity to progress into the future, the opportunity to teach other people how not to do the same thing I did. It's not helpful for me to keep repeating over and over and over again what I've just done, and maybe even what I did in the past. Next slide. I love this verse in the Bible, Philippians 4, verse 8, and I condensed it a little bit. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, are honest, pure, lovely, of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, finish it. Think on these things. Is that not just what I told you? Do you know the Bible is the originator of all truth? I love being a therapist reading the Bible. I'm sure if you do any other kind of job, you can read the Bible from your specific perspective. From if you work in the health field, if you're even a mechanic, a shepherd. Not sure how many people are shepherds here. I haven't seen any sheep, just cows. But anything that you do, you can read the Bible from that perspective. And I love reading the Bible from the perspective of a therapist, because everything I'm teaching my clients, everything that I'm talking to them about, God is the originator of that truth. And so as long as what I'm telling them is in the Bible, it's from God. Sometimes we like to limit God, and we like to go, oh, well, this isn't from the Bible because it doesn't specifically say this, this, and that verbatim. But if we look at the Bible and we see the same principles, is God not the originator? And I believe that God loves everyone so much that he'll even give truths to people who don't necessarily believe, only for them to find out later, oh, what I came up with is actually something God already talked about in his word. And so this is the key to thinking healthy. Next slide. So I'm going to give you some examples, and I just realized how small this looks, so I'll read them. So I'm going to show you what a lie looks like, a thinking lie, but I'm also going to show you what the truth looks like in place of it. The lie. My problems could never be solved. I could never feel truly happy or fulfilled. Why is this a lie? I already told you that it's a lie, but why is this a lie? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Why is this a lie? Some of you might have a hard time telling me why it's a lie because you might be telling it to yourself already. Sometimes we have problems and we think, oh, this will never be solved. It's too big. I'm going to ask you a question. This is something that's called Socratic Questioning, but Jesus did this too. I think he invented it and somebody came along. Did you want to say? You get to choose how you feel. Absolutely. I'm going to ask you a question though. How many of you in here are wearing shoes? Okay. How many of you have the right shoe on the right foot and the left shoe on the left foot? Now I'm going to ask you another question. When you were little, did you ever put the wrong shoe on the wrong foot? What do we call that? A problem. How many of you figured out how to solve that problem? All of you, I'm assuming. So, when we look at our problems and we say, my problems could never be solved, what are we ultimately saying? Haven't you ever had a problem in the past and it was solved? How do you know in the future those same problems can't be solved? It's usually because of something we call emotional reasoning. I feel it, therefore I think it's true. And so we say, my problems could never be solved because I feel overwhelmed by my problem right now. But does that mean that my problem will never be solved? No. It just means that I don't feel like it right now, or I can't see the solution right now. But how many problems have you had have taken just a bit of time before you came to the resolution of that problem? Does that mean you'll never be happy or fulfilled? No. It means it's just a matter of time, and sometimes the best happiness comes from learning how to solve a problem, right? And you feel more fulfilled because you got a part in that. How do your children feel when you do something for them versus when you show them how to do it? What does the Bible say about fishing? It's better to teach a person how to fish than to just give them a fish, right? And sometimes this is what God is doing with us. Instead of just giving us a solution to the problem, He's teaching us to trust the process and to learn and be okay with that. So I can name several problems that have been solved. And even within those solving of those problems, I've felt happiness and fulfilled. Number 2 lie, I'm basically worthless, defective, and inferior to others. That is a very bold statement. Sometimes I like to tell people, you're special, just not that special. Sometimes we like to be the outlier, no matter who we're around. I'm worse than that person, I'm worse than that person. But have you really taken the whole of every other person and the whole of yourself and concluded that you're worthless and inferior and defective to all people? As long as you have something that you can do, you're not entirely defective, right? I have lots of things in my house that might be broken, but I don't throw them away because they still can do something. I'm not saying I have a lot of broken things in my house, by the way. But there are things that, and sometimes you can fix something and it's even better. So just because I feel worthless doesn't mean I am. And sometimes we learn those things from other people. How about, if I'm numb, I need to hurt myself to feel something. Is that the only way to feel something? No. I can try healthy ways of feeling is a better option. No one will understand. They already have their own problems to deal with. Maybe I haven't asked the right people. My problems are important too. Or this one. No one cares. They'd be better off without me. How about instead, people care and God cares especially. This isn't the end of my testimony. This is one of my favorite things to remind myself is that, do you know how are good testimonies made? When you read a book and the book just says this person woke up and then this person went to sleep, How fun is that to read? You want to hear a good, juicy story. I want my life to be a testimony of all the good things that God has done in my life, despite all the bad things that might have happened. I want it to be a story of overcoming, but how do I overcome if there's nothing to overcome? And so sometimes God gives the best stories to the worst situations. All the stories in the Bible, think about them. David and Goliath. Is that a story of overcoming? How about Joseph? This is my favorite story in the Bible. Joseph, he spent how many years up and down and up and down and up and down and being, outcast by his own brothers and accused of things he never even did. And then how does the story end? Second in command in Egypt is the position. And my favorite quote in the Bible, where his brothers come to him and they're terrified that he's going to hurt them after all the things they've done to him in the past. And what does he say to them? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. Sometimes we tell ourselves a lie because the story's not over. And God's waiting to do something really special. Next slide. So I want to give you some examples of some helpful resources that you can use. One of my favorites, there's some other books there that I think are really helpful, but one of my favorite books on psychology is a book, it's actually a two-volume set called Mind, Character, and Personality. It doesn't read like a normal book because it's a compilation book, but there's some really great things in there. And from a therapist perspective, man, she's talking about stuff that I don't think they even realized, were happening back in the 1800s, and she's talking about them even before that. She even has quotes on obsessive compulsive disorder. If you read underneath the lines and stuff, she talks about anxiety, about depression. She talks about our thought life and the way we should be thinking. And so I recommend that book, especially volume 2. The volume 1 gets more into the health and stuff, the physical health, but the second volume gets more into the mental health. So I recommend that book. It's great, and you can get it on the Ellen G. White app on your phone for free, so you don't even have to buy the book. But it's called Mind, Character, and Personality, volumes 1 and 2. Next slide. I recommend doing something called cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, it's not necessarily the best thing just to find a cognitive behavioral therapist, but you want to find somebody who does Christian therapy. But those 3 books that I referenced, in addition, helpful Christian perspectives on cognitive behavioral therapy. I also like to recommend True Meditation. When we talk about meditation today, most people think about the sitting in Indian style with your hands like this going Om, but do you know that's only one form of meditation? David practiced a form of meditation in the Bible. Do you know what that was? It was focus on God's word and God's promises. And David, if you recognize his writing, he actually experienced depression in his life too. And the way he came out of that was meditating on God's word and his promises. When you're focusing on that, when you're taking specific verses from the Bible and you're meditating on them, you're reading them, you can even do this while you're walking, and it'll help commit it to your memory even more. But when you're meditating on his word and his promises, you will get better. You will absolutely get better. And that's also an example of gratitude, too. We can focus all of our thoughts on the negative things that are happening, or we can turn our thoughts to the positive things. And I'll just give you a game that I like to play. You can do this with your family, with your children. Kids actually really like it. I practice this with some of the kids that I work with. And what we do is I took this from a game that I used to play growing up. It's called I'm Going on a Trip and I'm Taking. And instead, I call it Today I'm Grateful For. And what you do is the first person says something that they're grateful for that starts with the letter A. The next person has to repeat what the first person said and add a B. And the third person has to repeat what the first person said, what the second person said, in something that starts with C. And so you have to remember it. You know one of the best things about that? If you're focusing on memorizing what the people before you just said, what are you not focusing on? All the depressing stuff that you were thinking of beforehand. And it's fun, too, because you have to remember it. So the list gets longer and longer and longer as you go. And so sometimes people are laughing because they couldn't remember something. And by the end of the game, you're feeling a lot better. Because all you've been talking about is all the things that you're grateful for, and you're really focusing on it, too. I want to read this quote because this is something that people will say, like, how come our church never talks about depression? Or how come they never talk about this and everything like that? I don't believe that's actually true. We have so many writings and in God's Word and Spirit of Prophecy that tell us that God cares about these things. And I just want to read this quote here for you right now. It says, I saw him looking on the dark side, distrustful of himself, and looking down into the grave. What does that mean when somebody's looking down into the grave? Does it mean they're literally standing on the edge of a big hole in the ground? What would that mean? Someone's thinking about death, thinking about suicide even. That's an archaic way of saying he's suicidal, right? So it says, and looking down into the grave, he must not dwell on these things, but look to Jesus, a pattern that is unerring. He must encourage cheerfulness. Didn't we just talk about gratitude and meditation on God's word and promises? Encourage in the Lord. Talk faith, talk hope, rest in God, and not feel that a severe, taxing effort is required on his part. All that God requires is simple trust, to drop into his arms with all his weakness and brokenness and imperfection. Next slide. And Jesus will help the helpless and strengthen and build up those who feel that they are very weakness itself. Isn't that what depression feels like sometimes? That you are very weakness yourself? God will be glorified in his affliction through the patience, faith, and submission exemplified by him. Oh, this will prove the power of the truth we profess. It is consolation when we need it. It is support when every prop of an earthly nature, which has been a measurable support, is removed. Before this started, we were singing a song called What a Friend We Have in Jesus. That was one of the songs that we sang this morning. That song took on whole new meaning several years ago. Well, actually, oh man, I can't even remember how many years ago, but it was when I was living down in Loma Linda. I had taken on a job and had gotten fired from the job the day before Sabbath. I'm not crying, I have a watery eye. The day before Sabbath, the next day, this job was one of the hardest jobs I had ever had in terms of my boss. And I had only been there for a month and a half, and it was that bad. She changed on me every single day. She liked me one day, she hated me, she was back and forth. I think she needed her own mental help. And I remember I got fired from the job, and I went to church the next day, and we were singing this song. And I had never sung it like I sang it that day. Because I realized, like, I had looked and looked and looked for this job for a very long time. I thought it was going to be the greatest job ever, only to find out that I was in the worst situation ever. And I was looking for another job while I was at that job for only a month and a half. And I remember thinking, why can't I find a job? Why is this not, like, why am I not finding something else? And then I get fired that day from it. I won't go into all the details and stuff. But I remember leaving, and it was the first time something that bad had happened to me, and I felt peace. Complete and utter peace. Now, I had cried afterwards because but it wasn't the cry of like, oh, this was the best job ever, why didn't this work out? It was the cry of relief. Like, I had put so much into trying to make this work, to find something else, and I realized in that moment, I had been trying to find another job And I got fired. Like, now what do? I'm stuck in this really weird place. And it dawned on me, you know, I wouldn't have ever left that job had she not fired me. And within a month, I had another job. But I wouldn't have left that job because I'm really stubborn. I don't like to give up on things. And God was like, are you going to trust me now? And I knew he was trustworthy because of all the other things that had happened in my life and stuff. But that was the first time I didn't get depressed over something like that. Because I knew God was faithful. And I think this is one of the things when we're depressed and when we have anxiety, there's a fear behind that. And I actually don't think depression and anxiety is the worst thing. I think it's the fear of depression and anxiety that's the worst thing. And I suddenly wasn't afraid. And I knew everything was going to be okay because I'd seen God work in my life beforehand. But so often, God has given us promises and we don't hold on long enough to get the promise. We jump in and try to do something on our own instead of saying, God, what do you have to teach me through this? I want to learn. And I think that's the thing that Jacob can show us in the story of him wrestling with God. One of the things I love about that is it says he wrestled with God. I think there's two meanings. When you wrestle with somebody, you're wrestling against them. But also he was wrestling with God. Who was there with him as he was wrestling? And God gave him something to remember that moment, and his life changed after that. And I think some of those principles are the very principles that even Joseph learned to be faithful when God took him through the things that he went through too. So we don't have to give up. We just have to ask, God, what would you have me learn through this? And so I thank you for being here and listening, and I hope you'll stay and hear the rest of our presentations. Let me pray before we end. Dear Father in heaven, I want to thank you that you've given us these wonderful things called minds, and you ask us to give them back to you in terms of how we think about our circumstances and how we'll trust you in the midst of them. Lord, help us to be true and faithful stewards of this mind that you've given us. Help us to take care of it, but also to discipline it in the way that you would have us do that. And we ask all these things, and we thank you because of the great gift that you've given us in Christ. And in his name we pray. Amen.
Wow, friends, were you guys blessed by that? That was amazing. So many good nuggets there. One of my favorites is that we don't have to identify ourselves as a feeling.